Well, cool. Well, good to see you all today. We are still doing Exodus, and then next week Leviticus, and then the week after that Numbers. Actually, when we think of the story of the Exodus, the first half of Exodus has the bulk of it, and then Numbers has the rest of the bulk. Well, half bulk and half bulk. First half of Exodus, and then the book of Numbers are where we get most of the story. Because as you've noticed, if you've been looking at Exodus, we story, and then we crunch into law. There's a lot of law in Exodus and a lot of instructions about building the tabernacle and things like that. So we've hit that part of Exodus. This is one of the parts that starts to discourage people. And then if they're trying to read through the whole Bible, then they get to Leviticus and they really get discouraged. But don't worry, we're gonna make, there's good stuff in Leviticus that we'll bring out next week, and there's good important stuff here. It might not be readily apparent right at the surface, but there is good stuff here. So before I jump in, any questions from you all at this point?
I have some questions.
Okay, Kathleen.
One, and you can fit this in, either answer now or fit it in, as you talk. But if you could go over some of the symbolism of the design of the temple, or like and I've heard this stuff before, I just couldn't remember it all. Like the Ark of the Covenant and things that are in the Ark. There was a reason they were put in,
Okay.
And the other question, and I don't know how detailed you want to get on this, but there's a part of the garment, and I don't know if that's the ephod and the Urim, or anyway, I can't remember which is which, but you know how they would, and the thought of this when I was reading on the law, because sometimes they go to the priest and they look for divine answers, and the priest, it's like the things on their chest would light up, the different letters or the 12.
The ephod, there's an ephod, then there's an Urim and Thummim.
Right.
They use to cast lots. Is that what we're talking about here?
Yes.
Good. Okay.
Yes.
I will be mentioning that later.
Okay.
A picture or two. So.
Yes.
So
okay. Thank you.
Sure. And Abby's got her hand up.
All right. In Exodus 28, we're given instructions about the ordination ceremony of Aaron and his sons in a lot of detail.
Uh-huh.
What about Moses' sons? Why don't they have some kind of a role?
That's interesting. Well, for one thing, they're not pure Jewish. They're half Midianite, which is interesting.
Okay.
But really, it's interesting. Moses kind of stays apart, even though he's of the same family as Aaron. The priestly line really does go through Aaron, and Moses doesn't choose his son as a successor. He's going to go to Joshua and the sons of Aaron, Eleazar and all those sons. So I don't know if that's because of their particular giftedness or what. Aaron seems to be messing up from time to time in the story. They somewhat whitewash some of that. But you're right. It doesn't flow through Moses' sons. Interestingly, I've been listening to a course on the Roman emperors, and the Roman emperors in the first century passed their power down hereditarily, and you had a mess. You had Caligula, you had Nero, you had Domitian, and then in the second century, in the 100s, they would pick the best person they could, then adopt him as a son, maybe at age 45 or whatever. And so it wasn't heredity. They still were their son, but and the second century of the Roman Empire worked much better than the first century because of that. So perhaps that's some of it, Abby. But that's a good question.
Okay, thank you.
There's no solid answer to it. So.
Dad?
Yeah, Jim.
But also, Aaron also takes on a priestly role in kind of rolling between Moses and everyone else in between early on in the plagues.
Yeah, Aaron is Moses' mouthpiece, so he has kind of an intermediary function there. And is that a precursor, or is that part of his talent that later gets used by God in a different way? That's a good question too. It's a chicken and egg kind of question, but it's a good point. But it's almost too, Abby, it almost seems like Moses stands apart from the priestly power scheme, and he is the one who ordains the priests. And so in some ways he is above the priesthood because he is the one that that ordains them. So maybe that's part of it too. Okay, y'all. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll dive in here. Yeah, Bob, go ahead.
Just real quick. I know it talks in the chapter about, well, the tabernacle and the priestly garments were likely, the description was probably likely reverse engineered from what was extant during the temple period. But it occurs to me that, the Ark of the Covenant, the description of the Ark of the Covenant is taken from the Ark of the Covenant, almost, because that's not something that's a one-shot construction. And even if they're the priestly discussions are saying, okay, God said to make it this size, they're actually going from the original actual artifact, not artifact, but God.
And you have a range of scholarly opinion. There are scholars all over the spectrum. Some, the Exodus is exactly right, and it's recording real history here about the tabernacle and the ark. Some scholars are on the other end, and in the 50s and 60s, a lot of scholars were on the end of, they're just looking at the temple and retrojecting that back into the wilderness and kind of making up the story of the tabernacle. But the pendulum has swung quite a bit since then, and there's a fair amount of scholars that the ark may not, the tabernacle may not be accurate in all of its details, every minor tiny detail, but there's certainly mention of the tent in David's story. The ark had to be kept somewhere. There was no temple building. There probably really was a tabernacle at some level, maybe not 100% exactly like, maybe there's more metaphor and things. So I tend to be of that school that, there really was probably a tent before there became a building, even though certainly the building and the tent share similar architecture. But we'll talk more about that too. Yeah, Trey.
Wondering and talking about whether what they did was retroject the temple, back onto the tent,
right,
tabernacle, whatever. Sometimes it seems to me like some people spend a lot of time getting bogged down in minutia. Why is that interesting? I don't understand why that matters.
Well, yeah, part of it too is the low-hanging fruits on doctoral dissertation has already been picked in a discipline as old as Scripture, and so you gotta kind of lock in. A friend of mine did a PhD in New Testament, and his dissertation was on the theology behind the crossings of the Sea of Galilee in the Gospel of Mark. Why was Jesus crossing the sea? Because all the easy stuff on Mark had already been done, so he had to really narrow in on something somewhat esoteric. It's actually a great thing, but so I think that's part of it too, Trey.
So I could get it down and really study the types of sandals people wore, whether or not they had heels to them or not. Were they like flip-flops or, and whether or not that was theologically significant.
And I think, and part of this, the theology of the ark is so important, and the theology of the tabernacle is so important that, even if it's not 100% historical, theologically it's still so very important. I'm sure that's why God has preserved that story for us, and the Holy Spirit has inspired it. Though I suspect there's a lot of historical reality to it as well. Yeah, Bob.
One more question on the ark I meant to ask. Are there not graven images on the ark?
Well, not of God. There are graven images of cherubim, and we'll look at that. So good question there. That's one of the reasons Muslims they don't like any kind of depictions of God or the prophet in their art, and they just do abstract stuff. They think Christians dance a little too close, having pictures of Jesus and other things hanging up in their houses. They think we're a little too close to graven images with that. So, that's a good question, though.
Jim?
Yes. Good job.
What happened to the ark?
The ark?
Is there any? Yeah. When do we last hear about it?
Well,
What-
it gets carried off in the Babylonian exile, and it's gone. It's taken to Egypt actually, and so the Indiana Jones movies where he's looking for it in Egypt, if it's in Egypt, could be destroyed. It just kind of disappears from history at that point. The Coptic Christians, centered in Ethiopia and Egypt, claim they have it. It's too holy for anybody to see. We're not going to show it to you. We're not going to let archaeologists study it. We're not going to let scientists monkey around with something as holy as the Ark. But the Coptic Christians claim to still have it. But
Where are they?
they are in
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia and Egypt. But they are not saying where it is, and they won't show you what it is. And Jimmy, you want to get on that?
Yeah, and they also, so they have it in one church, but I don't remember where it is. But they also, on a liturgical architectural note, they will put a mini Ark of the Covenant in all of their churches when they're consecrated by the altar. So just to make another point that we've got it, so we need to have it in all of our churches too in some way.
But nobody else is allowed to see it. So they might. The Coptic Church is ancient. The Coptic Church may have been founded by the Ethiopian eunuch from the Book of Acts. That's their claim. And so it could be there, or it could be in a warehouse, from Indiana Jones. We'll do an American warehouse and it's lost. Trey, yeah.
So the Coptic Church in Lubbock, do they have a little mini ark?
I don't know. It's
I can't remember with Copts because there's a ton of little tiny. They're called Oriental Orthodox, and there's a bunch of little. They're all different from each other, so it's hard to remember who's what. But
good question. Good question. I don't know, Trey. So. Yeah, Regina.
When did they make this claim that they had the Ark?
Well,
Out
I
of
don't think-
curiosity.
I don't think it's new. That's a good question. I'm not sure exactly when. It may have been all the way through. I'm absolutely not sure.
So Jim, if you go to those countries, are you allowed as a non-Coptic to visit their churches?
I've set foot in only one Coptic church in my life, and it was a monastery built on top of the roof at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because they wouldn't let the Copts have space inside the building, so they just squatted on the roof and eventually built that up. But I'm not sure exactly what the rules are. I've never been to Egypt or Ethiopia, so good question.
I'm sure you'd be able to visit, and depending on how strict they are, because we are still kind of baptized, even though we follow the Council of Chalcedon, so we're kind of weird. But I think we'd be able to visit. But some of those churches also take, I think especially the Ethiopian ones, they take the law seriously, and they follow the dietary laws and everything still. And they also, just in case you're trying to get a sneak peek or anything, they have tons of veils all around the altars too to hide everything from lay people and everything. So
Cool. Well, great questions today. Well, I do have some. We'll touch on it. We'll look at the Ark towards the end here. But let me go ahead and put up the PowerPoint I did here. All right. So again, I've shown this slide before. We're still part of the Moses epic, and that is about 16% of the Old Testament. So we're still well in that, and will be for several more weeks till we get to the book of Joshua. And at this part of Exodus, we are down around Mount Sinai, and that's the traditional location down there. We talked about that a little bit last week, but the setting of this last half of Exodus is completely around that mountain. The people won't move until the book of Numbers. They get to Mount Sinai in the middle of Exodus, and they stay there until they leave in the book of Numbers. So this week and next week will still be gathered around Mount Sinai. The sections our book was focusing on was the first chunk was the covenant code, and then the second chunk was Exodus 25 to 40. So just a few words about this covenant code. 10 Commandments start in chapter 20, but then there are some laws that are there after that. And scholars have nicknamed this the covenant code. There are a couple of other sections they look like kind of standalone sections of laws that the Jews had at some level, at some point, and they inserted them in. Now, were they originally given to Moses and kept separately? Did they arise later? There's all kinds of scholarly discussion about that. But the three codes that are kind of inserted into the Pentateuch, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, are the Covenant Code, the Holiness Code, and the Deuteronomic Code. And I'll talk about Holiness Code a little bit next time, or I've already talked about it. You'll get to see it next time because it's recorded. And Deuteronomic Code, I'll plan to talk about when I get back, when we talk about Deuteronomy. But again, Trey, there are all kinds of scholarly opinions about this, and they run the whole gamut about when these things were inserted in. The Covenant Code has a wide variety of topics. It seems like it may have been inserted where it was because there's some talk about what happens if you violate the 10 Commandments. There is a fair amount of mention of that. There are penalties, and they're often capital penalties. It's something you don't want to violate these commands of God. But there's also all kinds of other stuff. There's damage to livestock and crops. There's talk about rules for slavery and letting your slaves go free, and how you should do that, and Jubilee and all that. There are topics about what right worship is. And at the end of the Covenant Code, it gives God's promise that God will give the people the promised land. There are already inhabitants there, but God will make sure that they are pushed out if, and this will be a theme later, especially in Deuteronomy and all the books that come from the same school as Deuteronomy. We'll talk about that later, but that's Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, a good chunk of the prophets. That school, this is a huge theme over and over. It's conditional. You've got to remain faithful to God. And part of the history of the next 600 years of Judaism is, are the people going to be faithful to God? And at times they are, and at times they're not. And they go back and forth. So this will not be the last time we see that theme. It's kind of one of the first mentions of it in Scripture, but it's going to be huge. And it is very conditional. If you obey me, this is great, and all these good things will happen. If you don't, bad things will happen. And eventually the people are exiled from the Holy Land because of that. And so that's going to be a large overarching theme from the book of Deuteronomy all the way through the end of 2nd Kings. But we'll get to that more later. Also in the Covenant Code, one of the early mentions of an eye for an eye. And we hear Jesus talk about, you've heard it said an eye for an eye, but you should forgive each other. You should love your neighbor. You should turn the other cheek. And so we might be tempted to view eye for an eye as negative. But given the context of what was happening before that, an eye for an eye is actually a big constraining law. It constrains a lot of really nasty options. You poke out my eye, I kill you. You kill my brother, I kill your whole family. Those kind of vendettas were apparently fairly common. And so an eye for an eye really constrains things, making things proportional. If you poke out my eye, my relatives can poke out your eye. If you knock out my tooth, we can knock out one of your teeth. You cut off my hand, we can cut off one of your hands. It constrains things. I won't wipe out your whole family because you cut off my hand or poked out my eye. We are putting some limits on things. So we might see that as kind of negative because of the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus certainly takes it to another level ethically. But there is some real ethical raising here, some constraining of negative, nasty behavior in this statement in Exodus. Also in the Covenant Code is some of the first mention of how important it is to care for those on the margins. And you've got resident aliens in your midst. And remember, in the Exodus, there are resident aliens already in the people's midst. There are some folks that leave Egypt with them that are not descendants of Abraham. And they are with the people in the wilderness, and they will apparently go into the promised land with them. Also, those who are powerless, and remember it's a patriarchal system, those who are without fathers or males in their family system, well, you better take care of them and not abuse them and take advantage of them just because there's no male in their family to help them. God will step in and do that. So you better be careful. And it's pretty brutal here. You abuse them, you're going to be killed. God will take you out if you and your wives will be widows and orphans. How will you like that? So, so be careful about abusing these folks on the margin. So there's some constraining of other behaviors that were very common in the Middle East. Well, these folks are defenseless. They're weak. We can take total advantage of them. Well, no. And so there's some real constraint in the covenant code about that. And later in the covenant code, one of the reasons given is, well, remember, y'all were aliens in Egypt. So treat those strangers in your midst in a good way, because you all were once in that situation. All right, that's a very quick touch on the covenant code. Any thoughts or questions before I move on to the next little chunk here? I see John.
Yeah, Jim, and part of that is that if a slave wants to be free at 7 years, that's no problem. He is a free man. But if he has a wife with children and he wants to be free, then the code says that the owner of the slave, gets to keep the children and the wife as his. And if the slave doesn't like that, then he will stay as a slave and have a part of his ear punched out.
With an awl, yes.
Yes, with an awl in the ear. I mean, I guess, what was the intent of all of that complicated business there? Was it to ensure that he would keep the slave, or because he really valued the woman and the children?
I think that latter part is more of a piece of it, and we've got to be careful here. We read this in terms of antebellum slavery in the South, and we also read it with 21st century eyes. That slavery is one of the most wicked things that ever happened in the United States, and it was one of the great moral wrongs that we perpetrated. And so we read it through those eyes. We've got to, and we also read it with a racial tinge, because it was Black Africans that were enslaved. You didn't have blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norwegian slaves. It was very much a racial, ethnic thing. So we read it with all those layers. Slavery was presupposed in the ancient world all the way through Jesus's world, and Paul, and they're talking about slavery, and slavery would be entered into oftentimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily, and so the way I read all this, John, is that these are constraints. They're trying to make the slavery system that everybody does, every nation on earth at the time practiced slavery. They're trying to make it more humane and put some boundaries on it. It's still not good and perfect from our standpoint by any stretch of the imagination. So we still read it with 21st century eyes and go, ugh, slavery. But they are putting, you've got some progressive. It's a rising tide ethically. You're making slavery kinder and gentler. Okay, we could still argue slavery is bad, but is despotic slavery as bad as a more benevolent slavery? Well, I'd probably pick the benevolent option, and you want to have constraints on slave owners and law that constrains slave owners. They don't just get to do whatever they want. And so all the slavery stuff in the Pentateuch, that's kind of the lenses I put on immediately. We are constraining what the rest of the culture is doing, for what it's worth.
Jim,
Sure.
Do they say anything about when the slave is old and no longer able to work? I've been reading Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Wind, Sand, and Stars, and he encountered slavery in crossing the Middle East. I guess the Bedouins had slaves and from North Africa, and they when they got old and couldn't work, they just abandoned them, and no one would take on the old slave, and he would just starve in the streets, basically.
Wow.
So
I don't recall anything from the Pentateuch about what happens, what kind of pension plan do you have, what do you do with older slaves? That's a great question. I have absolutely no clue on that. A lot of people didn't grow that old, and old people in the biblical world tended to be honored. But if you're a slave and old, then maybe not. But that's a great question. I really have no good answer for. All right. Well, let's move off the covenant code and look at the second part of our Exodus today. And what we've got here, if you're into building plans and into building descriptions, this is your section here. Somebody said if you watch This Old House and those kind of building renovation shows, this is the kind of stuff that you might really like, because there's a lot of instructions about how to build the tabernacle, how to furnish it, and then not only do you give instructions, you also talk about building it. So we give the instructions to build it, and now we execute the building plans. And so there's a lot of that in this section. There's some other things scattered in here. We've got the golden calf. We've got another set of law given, and so we'll talk about that. In fact, let's tackle that piece first. What's the so-called ritual decalogue? There are 3 sets of the 10 commandments, or there are 3 sets of 10 commandments. Let's not say the 10 commandments, because that's a little misleading. There are 3 sets that consider themselves sets of 10 commandments. The first and the third share a lot more overlap in Exodus and Deuteronomy. But this second set of 10 commandments in Exodus is very different. The question is this just a different set of 10 laws that God happened to give? Is this another group in Israel that understood these were the most 10 important laws that God gave and emphasized that, and then when the final editor put it together, they just put these in? That could be. Remember, the final editor highly values every story about God, whether it's from this group or that group, this tribe or that tribe, and the editor, for better or worse, and I think it's better, says these stories are so important, we're not going to lose them. We are going to preserve them, even if it makes things messy and uncomfortable. And we're not going to just whitewash over the whole thing or try to blend it together. We'll have distinct layers, makes it complicated for us. But I think it tells us how much they're valuing this as scripture, as stories about God, as coming from the Holy Spirit, even though they don't understand how everything necessarily lines up. And so the ritual decalogue could be from one of these other groups, the northern bunch of Israelites instead of the southern bunch. There's going to be a civil war later, and we'll get to that later, after the time of King David and King Solomon. Well, we've got this ritual decalogue set in there. I won't go through all these, but it is very different, and there's discussion about how do you break up the verses into 10 chunks. The reason you have to, I'll go through real quick, is at the end it says Moses wrote these down, the tablets, the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments at the end. So they're very much seen here as 10 statements, but they're not the same. First one talks about not making covenants. When you come into the promised land, don't cozy up to your neighbors too much. Take care of the resident aliens in your midst, but don't cozy up to your neighbors, because they will lead you astray. And there's lots of worry about Asherah poles, sacred poles and pillars and altars. And this is a foreshadowing, perhaps, because this is going to be a huge snare for the Israelites. They will not really get past this until after the exile, and they get back home in the 500s BC. So for 600 years, this is going to be a huge, huge snare when they're in the promised land. All the neighbors' religious practices. And we'll be talking about that a lot more as we go through. No cast idols. It's a little bit different from graven images, but somewhat similar there. Keep the Passover for 7 days in the future. So give this rule. The firstborn belong to me. All your male livestock and your sons, and you can buy your sons back. Jesus, there's a ceremony where Jesus is taken to the temple in the 2nd chapter of Luke to observe these ancient commands of being redeemed or bought back from God. You offer the firstborn to God, and then you pay God back for that son to get that child back. We'll also see that in Samuel. Hannah, her firstborn son, she literally takes him to the tabernacle, and he serves the priests there. That's later on. You get a Sabbath command, so that is similar to the 10 Commandments. There's a command to observe the Feast of Pentecost or the Feast of Weeks, and so that we'll talk more about those festivals later on, and I think in the Leviticus section. 3 times in the year, all of your males shall appear before God. So they shall all come to the tabernacle or to the shrine or wherever the ark is. And if you do that, I'll cast out the nations and enlarge your borders, and you shall make 3 showings to don't just live out in the countryside, don't be a hermit, but you show up for these religious festivals. Don't offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven, and Passover should not be left until morning. So that's interesting. Don't mix blood with any kind of yeasty stuff. Okay, why is that a problem? Well, that's just the command here. Bring the best of the first fruits of your ground. Don't don't bring us the leftovers to God. Bring the best offerings of what you have. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. That's kind of an obscure thing. And these are some of them are ethically important, and some are kind of just seem a little arbitrary. But then God says, write these in accordance with the words, and Moses is up 40 days, 40 nights, and he wrote these down and brought them down as 10 commandments. So is this a second set of 10 commandments? Is this another group's understanding of what the 10 commandments are? Good question, and not a real easy answer to that. But we do have this ritual decalogue here. Okay, in the midst of all this, we also have stories of the golden calf, very famous, a lot of paintings. It's filmed in Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments, though they add in some stuff from later in Numbers. When the earth opens and swallows up Dathan, Dathan doesn't get swallowed up until many months, couple of years, maybe a year and a half later. But we've got this golden calf story. So while Moses is on the mountain, getting whichever set of 10 commandments it is, the original set or this second set or both, and all the other laws for building the tabernacle, while God is telling Moses to build this shrine to me in your midst, the people build this calf. So what is going on? This is a tough thing. Moses has just gone for 40 days and the people go crazy. It seems like idolatry. While God is saying no graven images, they're building a graven image. Well, what's going on here? Well, it's a complex story, and there are many possibilities, and I won't say that there are easy answers. There are many possibilities. For one thing, it is consistently a calf, and most of the neighbors worship bulls. And so there are some scholars that suggest this is a joke. This is meant to show how pathetic the Hebrews' idolatry is. Because whereas the neighbors worship bulls, all they can come up with is a little weenie calf god. So that could be a piece of this. Some humor that their idolatry falls short of, they can't even do idolatry right. So that could be a possibility. There are other possibilities too. Also, if it's a bull or a calf, Egyptians worshipped bull gods, and Canaanites, the folks in the Promised Land, worship bull gods. Where's the influence coming from? Good question, and not an easy answer for that. If they're coming out of Egypt, maybe that was more influential. If they're retrojecting it from problems the Jews would have later, maybe it's the Canaanite that's more of the issue. But, all right. The other big question is this mistaken worship of Yahweh. Are we trying to worship the Lord God, Yahweh, who brought us out of Egypt? And look at the statements here. These are your gods, O Israel, when they make the calf. These are your gods. Aaron says to the people who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. These are your Elohim. And tomorrow shall be a festival to Yahweh. Now, Elohim is always plural, but sometimes it refers to God, the singular God, in the plural, the royal we. So is Aaron intending, he's talking about the name of Yahweh here, is he intending this calf to be part of the way we worship Yahweh? Well, it's ironic if it is, because God is telling Moses how Aaron's going to be a high priest and all this, and Aaron is screwing up while Moses is getting those instructions. So ironic. But this could be some remnant of idolatry that the people haven't purged out of their system, and they worship God. They think they're worshiping the God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, with this golden calf. So that is a possibility here. Also later on, and this is a scholarly, here's your PhD obscure dissertation. Your book did talk about this a little bit. Later on, one of the northern kings, one of the wicked ones, Jeroboam, will build some calves and set them up in shrines in the north and the south of his kingdom. And so maybe this is a retrojection. Well, Jeroboam did it. let's put it back also in the book of Exodus to show how bad it was. So this could be retrojected, some scholars say. But again, we've got that same problem. When they did that, here are your Elohim. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Are the calves doing it, or is it the God of Israel doing it? Or is it some weird amalgam that they really haven't sorted out yet? Are they still thinking of God can you worship the God of Israel with these pagan idols? And haven't quite purged that from their system. Trey, go ahead.
Well, I mean, Elohim, yeah, that's plural, but it was often used as a singular for God. But in these cases, when they're saying, here are your gods, are they saying, here are your gods, or here is your God?
Well, we don't get that. Here gods, here Elohim.
So there's no surface form of to be there?
Yeah, it's so, here, and so you're not conjugating that. It's always conjugated plural, as I understand it, Trey. I could be mistaken about that, but I understand that you have to, they get it from context. Translators have to make the decision every time they see Elohim, whether they're going to do singular or plural based on context. I don't think there's a verb conjugation. Hebrew is so primitive. Ancient Hebrew is so primitive, tiny vocabulary, takes a lot of work to translate. And so
they didn't necessarily have a difference between singular and plural verb forms?
Right, and that's my understanding. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but they always talk about the context and whether they're going to go with Elohim plural or singular. So.
Okay.
They didn't even have vowels.
Yeah, I didn't even have vowels. Yeah, and I'm not sure how much they conjugated verbs. I never took biblical Hebrew. I learned the alphabet and forgot most of it. But so I'm not deep on Hebrew, but that is a possibility. And there are all kinds of obscure scholarly articles about that you can delve into. The other interesting thing here is it looks like the final editor may be giving, the final editors were probably priests. And so maybe they're giving Aaron a little bit of a whitewash here. King David gets a whitewash later. King David in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel has all of his warts. But then there's another set of stories about David in the books of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And David can do no wrong in those books. And so it looks like maybe there's some of that going on for Aaron. You've got the verses here. Aaron took the gold and formed it in a mold and cast an image of a calf. But then later Aaron is saying when Moses comes down, Aaron says, well, I said, whoever has gold, take it off. They gave it to me. I threw it in the fire. And boom, out came this calf. Not my fault. So is that humorous? Is that Aaron denying his responsibility? Is that later priests trying to show their number one priest ancestor as being better than he was? That's a good question. Again, no real answer. So the golden calf really brings up more questions than it gives answers. There's also an orgy involved. That's another matter. Sex was we'll talk about this later. Sex was very much a part of pagan worship cross-culturally, but we'll leave that one aside for now. Okay, so ritual decalogue, golden calf, and Moses also pleads with the people and asks for a view of God's backside. We'll talk a little more about that later. But then we get all these instructions about, later meaning future weeks, we get these instructions about the tabernacle, the furnishings, the vestments, God's choice of the craftsman, in building and setting it up. And again, y'all read in the book, some scholars think this is retrojected based on the pattern of the temple. But again, as I said, a lot of scholars think, no, there's sufficient evidence that this really has to have a historical core. It's too far-fetched to think this is just retrojected. And there, even in David's time, there is that tent where David hangs out, where Samuel grew up. And until Solomon builds the temple, it's in a tent. So we've got all these instructions here about the tabernacle and about the vestments. That's probably a reconstruction as best we can tell. That's an artist's interpretation of what the vestments look like. And we do have this ephod that the high priest wore. It's fascinating. I love Jesus Christ Superstar. And in the hippie version from the 70s, the high priests and the assisting priests have these ephods on. They use that as part of the hippie costume for the high priest, which is kind of fascinating. And even in a 2000 version of Jesus Christ Superstar, the high priest has a version of an ephod. It's not as realistic as this particular version. So, and attached with the ephod is something called the Urim and Thummim that we have absolutely no idea what it is. It was some way to flip a coin or cast lots or get a yes or no, black or white answer that the high priest could use under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit for certain spiritual questions. So some way that attached to this ephod were this Urim and Thummim that we have no idea what they are, but it can give you an answer, yes or no. So that's also part of these high priestly vestments. All right, reconstruction there, that's probably what the tabernacle looked like. There are kind of two halves. I'm holding my hand up, that doesn't help you. There are two halves here, and your book had a good diagram that the altar, if you divide these two halves, they're actually two squares, and the altar is in the center of one square, and the Ark of the Covenant should be in the center of the second square. And so the Ark of the Covenant sits inside this tent. There is an outer chamber and an inner chamber, and there's this outer chamber of the whole tent compound itself. So we've got increasing levels of holiness. And Levites can come here and help with the sacrifices, but only priests can go into the tabernacle, and only the high priest can go into the holiest place, the Holy of Holies, to do things. Now, of course, when they took things down, the Levites would have to get in there and pick up the Ark of the Covenant, and there were Levites assigned, a family of Levites assigned to moving that thing on those poles, not touching it, but using the poles. Same with the altar. The altar had poles. It was portable. There's a bronze basin to wash things. And all these things will be present in the temple later on. They'd be more permanent. They wouldn't be on poles and portable, but they would be there. In fact, the washing basin is huge. And Mormon churches, I think, recreate this in their church architecture for some reason. Yeah, Trey.
Where did they get all the material for this stuff if they're running around in the desert?
Well, that's the scholars that say this is all made up would say that. If you look back in Exodus, though, when they are taking the people out of Egypt that night, Pharaoh talks about spoils of Egypt. It talks about the neighbors giving them gold and stuff. Also depends on how many you have. They're talking about melting down their gold jewelry, and that was a way of carrying your gold with you as a nose ring or an earring, and they did wear nose rings and earrings. And so perhaps that's it. One of the bizarre parts is the outer layer is something we're not sure what it is. It seems to be some kind of aquatic animal. Some Bibles translate as dolphin skin, some as seal skin or sea cow skin. But scholars are really not sure what that outer layer material is. Do you go down and kill sea cows on the shore of the Red Sea? Perhaps. Is there enough leather? How many manatees or sea cows does it take to make a big tent covering? Good question. But there are layers of goat hair and other things. I'll look at that. I think the next slide has a picture.
Jim?
Yeah.
Do any of these plans show anything about where these people who broke the covenants were executed? And who were the executioners?
The golden calf story has the tribe of Levi coming to Moses' side and kind of sweeping through the camp. And they take, I think it's like 1,500 people. So it's a fraction. It's not, they don't wipe out everybody that sinned. But it looks like, whoever Moses says, Moses is in charge. And in that particular one, the golden calf story is the Levites. They consecrate themselves in blood as God's servants still. But they don't really specify who's supposed to carry out these capital sentences. Eventually there'll be a king, but there's no king at this point. Moses is in charge. It's a theocratic thing. So apparently Moses would have to appoint someone. But that's a good question.
And Levites were Moses's kind of family-ish too, right?
Yeah, Levites are the tribe that Moses and Aaron are part of. So the priests are the inner circle, and the Levites are the larger set that they're a subset of. But you've got these various layers of cloth and dyes and gold covering the wood. One of the reminders in the temple, the Holy of Holies was square. Actually, it's a cube in the temple. Revelation will make a big deal of that. People have made recreations of the temple. This is one that they take around and set up. They brought this to Wichita, actually, this particular group, and set it up. We didn't get to see it. I was going to take the kids, and then stuff happened, and we didn't actually get to see it. But they do have recreations of this that get carried around for folks to look at. In the Holy of Holies is the Ark of the Covenant. Oftentimes in art, we have these very Western-looking angels on top of the Ark of the Covenant. Because we think of angels like this, and that actually comes out of Greco-Roman art, are pictures of angels, and that's there was no Greco-Roman art like that back in the day. This is probably what people were thinking of when they were thinking of angels and cherubim. That's the Egyptian look and the Assyrian look for angels, for cherubim. Not friendly little babies with wings and cute little pudgy faces, but these pretty fearsome looking sphinx-like creatures is what they think of as cherubs. So the Ark of the Covenant probably has something a little more Egyptian looking. Some recreations even have kind of sphinx-like things on there. Raiders of the Lost Ark actually it's a little more Egyptian, so I kind of like that. I thought they did a decent job with that. Also later in the temple, there'll be big statues of cherubim set up over the Ark of the Covenant. And again, in Western art, some of them look very Western. You have these two diagrams look like Western angels. But again, we're probably talking about something much more Sphinx-like when they do set the temple up. The big cherubim, the tower over the little ark in the middle of the Holy of Holies. Yeah, Trey, go ahead.
So the statues of this cherubim, how does that fit in with the commandment not to have graven images?
Well, this is the image of God's throne, and God has angels protecting him, and so you're not worshiping the cherubim as gods themselves. They are God's servants,
Okay.
and if they are to protect the ark here symbolically. If God has angels, I'm sure, protecting the ark. Isaiah has a vision of this, and there are all kinds of cherubs and seraphim and things protecting God in the ark. The other thing, they talk about the mercy seat. That's actually the lid of the ark. This is not meant to represent God. The most the Jews will say about this is that this is God's throne or footstool. That God is enthroned upon this ark or upon this mercy seat, but it's like his footstool or his throne. It's not him himself. And so it's not a graven image of God himself. And this mercy seat image actually makes it into the New Testament. It's not translated in most Bibles as mercy seat, but that is the word in the book of Romans, and it's also mentioned in Hebrews. In one other place, I believe, Philistirian comes up. But it's the place where the blood is sprinkled in Leviticus. We'll talk about that with Leviticus next week. There is actually a sculpture recently called the Mercy Seat. There's a rotunda that has these two sets of cherub wings on either side of this rotunda. You can see just tips of the wings here. It's not a very good picture of the whole thing because it's hard to get the whole rotunda. But there's that set of wings. Anybody know where this is? Happens to be in Lubbock, Texas.
Where?
That's the Bible department at LCU. They're very proud of this new sculpture. They just dedicated it last fall. I was there for the dedication. It's kind of cool. So they kind of think of, entering the study of Scripture as entering in and seeing God and being part of the mercy seat. So they have this iconography at LCU now for their Bible department, which is kind of neat. And they're kind of thrilled with that. Okay, so we get all these instructions about building this tabernacle. And the important thing about the tabernacle is not that you've got this tent, but that God's presence fills it. And at the end of the book of Exodus, that's what does happen. God comes in a manifestation of cloud, the pillar of cloud and pillar of fire by night, settles in the tabernacle. God's glory somehow manifests itself in cloud and fire and smoke and all those manifestations in this tabernacle. And when the cloud moves, the people pick up the tabernacle and the rest of their camp and move following it. And that's going to be their pattern through the book of Numbers and into the book of Deuteronomy, that they will follow God's presence. Also at this point, Moses will never go back up on the mountain of Sinai. Nobody else in the Bible goes up on the Mount of Sinai until you get Elijah. How many years later? 700s. So 700 years later, 5 to 700 years later, you get Elijah going on Mount Sinai. But just because he's depressed and hiding out from things, never again is Sinai going to be the center of things. Now this is vitally important. From now on, God will be in the midst of his people in an intimate way. You won't go to God. God will be with you. And that's a fascinating shift. Most cultures had a permanent temple where their god or gods lived, or a shrine on a mountain, or a high place where their god or gods lived. The Greeks even have Mount Olympus for their gods. But the Jewish folks have a God that's portable. a God that moves with them, a God that's not constrained by geography. That makes God very, very powerful. And it's very interesting in John's gospel, when we get to Christmas time, John, first chapter, the word was made flesh and dwelt among us. The word dwelt is the Greek word for the tabernacle. It is God setting up camp in the midst of our campground, just like God was in this tabernacle. God will be in the midst of things in Jesus Christ. And so Christianity takes it a step further. No longer do we have to look for God where the Ark of the Covenant is set up and where this tent is, but wherever Jesus is, God is present. And so that'll be an important thing for the Jews, and it'll be an important thing for Christians later on. Their God is portable, movable. And that'll be important later on, too, when they lose their Ark of the Covenant and lose their temple and are taken off into exile in Babylon. Ezekiel has a huge image of God's symbolic throne appearing on wheels, wheels within wheels, even in Babylon. God's not constrained by geography, and God's not defeated when his temple or his tabernacle are gone, or his Ark of the Covenant is gone. That's just his throne, his footstool. It's not him. And so that's important later. Kathleen asked about the other stuff in the Ark. What they'll put in is the Ten Commandments. There's some other traditions in other places of Scripture that they also put in some manna. A jar of manna is kept, supposedly, and Aaron's staff that will bud. And we'll get that story in the book of Numbers later on, that there are more remnants from the wandering in the wilderness than just the Ten Commandments. So the Ten Commandments are important. It's God's law given to humans. The manna is important. That's God's daily bread. The budded staff is a way of showing the priests God does bless the tribe of Levi more than the other tribes. We'll get to that story later on. But those are all contained and kept in this ark that they carry from this point forward. Okay, y'all, I went a little long today. We had a lot of questions up front, which is great, and I went a little long. But any final stuff here? Let me get out of screen sharing here. Talk to her. I see.
Yeah, Jim.
Yeah.
Kathleen's question, I think, was those things that were referred to God for a judgment. How did they know what God's ruling was?
That was that Urim and Thummim, and we don't know what that device was, but it's some device that gives you a binary answer: yes or no, up or down, black or white. There is that Urim and Thummim the high priest would carry attached to his ephod somehow. And since we don't know what it was, we're not sure how it attached or how big it was, but there was some kind of device that the high priest could cast lots in some way and get a binary up or down answer.
So we know it was just by chance, the ruling.
Well, and later on, well, if it's not by chance, if God's directing how the thing falls, and so that's the thought. And later on, the church will cast lots to decide who replaces Judas. It is before the coming of the Holy Spirit in the book of Acts. It's a chapter before that. But their belief is that God will direct the high priest's special up and down Urim and Thummim decision-making device to give the right answer. And so they're trusting God in that, not just random chance. Look, flipping a coin seems tough to me, but that's a lot of trust in God to make the coin flip the right way. Magic 8-ball, you shake that up and the answer flows to the top. Well, if you're trusting God, though, and if it's the high priest, and if you're only pulling it out for very special questions, it's not should we have lamb or beef tonight? It's not for that kind of for important questions when the high priest has to make a judgment. We pull this thing out. Okay, y'all. Well, that was a lot of stuff there. Next week we'll talk about the book of Leviticus, and I think it'll be more interesting than you think it'll be. So we'll pick up there next week, and y'all take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.